Well, Ellen, you have written or co-authored 20-some books. I have written or co-authored 20-some books. And I don't know if you feel the way I do, but each time a new one comes out, it feels like the birth of a new baby. And you wait for it, and you work hard on writing it, and then you have that waiting period while they produce it. And then the day comes when it officially launches. And then, do you feel celebrative on those days?
No.
You feel excited, like eager to see how people respond to the new baby?
Well, there's always a healthy dose of fear, too. How will people respond? But to me, it is a wild thing every time to think, oh, my goodness, this had been just ideas and nights and days of arduous labor. And then to see it out in public, something that people can have in their hands and read and draw their own conclusions, is a wonderful thing.
The labor. I've told my sister
Yes.
many times that when I'm writing a book, I'm in labor. It's like birthing a child. Well, she's had 5 children, and she says, I don't know what I'm talking about.
That could be true.
But it's in a little different way, the labor and delivery process. And it really is a joyful thing to see it take on a life of its own. And today is a birthday
Hooray!
of a book that you have poured a lot of heart and labor into. The new authorized biography, drum roll please, of Elisabeth Elliot. Our listeners have been waiting for this book, have been eager for it. This is the early years of Elisabeth. It's called Becoming Elisabeth Elliot. And I'm already telling you, I can't wait for the second volume because I've read this one, and I know you're still working on that, and we don't know exactly when it will release, but in the meantime, we're really thankful to have this one and to be unpacking for our listeners what I've already had the joy of reading, and that is glimpses into the early years and the making of the Elisabeth Elliot we knew and loved when she was an older woman. Some things that your book helps us discover that we've never known before.
Right. It was interesting to me, even when I started working on this book, all of us, I think, have a tendency to think of Elisabeth Elliot as twice widowed and middle-aged.
Yes.
Because
That's when we first came to know her.
Right, right. And much of her public ministry was in that season of her life. But she was a young, inquisitive, curious, passionate, funny, not yet formed young woman. And that's the story that this book tells.
She didn't start old.
She did not start old.
She didn't start mature. She didn't start this woman who was this font of wisdom.
Right, right.
God had her on a journey, and those things were developing in her, and sometimes through really hard pathways.
Right. And the thing that I enjoy about this is this book made Elisabeth Elliot more relatable.
Yes.
In her older years, when she was on a platform, she was fairly severe and intimidating, and we knew what she was saying was true, but there was not necessarily the kind of connection that I found myself feeling with her as I wrote this book. And a lot of that came because I was given all of her journals. And so to have these, a lot of them leather-bound books filled with her flowing handwriting that chronicled the days, the years, the decades of a long life was an incredible privilege, very poignant to me.
She started journaling really young, didn't she?
Right. This was expected in her family, a very literate and literary family. And so,
actually from the Philadelphia area, where I'm from.
Yes.
And so my parents were familiar with the Howard family.
Right.
And it's fun now to look back and see what was going on in her life as she was growing up in that home.
Yes, yes. And we'll come back to that in a second because it's interesting. All of us are products initially, right, of our home of origin. So Elisabeth started, young Betty, she was Betty, of course, back then, Betty Howard, excuse me.
We
Betty
didn't dare
Howard.
call her Betty, but that's how she was known then.
To everyone back then.
Yes.
And so her first journal that I have at home in my office is this little stubby sort of diary that's written in pencil in handwriting that is immature. And it says on the outside of it, private property, no boys allowed. Men, women, and girls may look at this, but no boys. So I
Well,
felt...
what's in it?
Yeah. It's...
She was, around 11?
Yeah. And so in it are very dutiful journal entries about her daily life as an 11-year-old and what they played each day after school out in the neighborhood. And then the journals over the years take her through, like all of us, high school. And she went to a boarding school and had many adventures there. None of us would want our high school journals known by others, would we? Right.
Not me for sure.
So full of romantic intrigue. We'll come back to that. But I was struck in these journals as the story of her life over the years, that it poured out day by day by day by day. And again, the picture that some of us have of Elisabeth Elliot is that very severe, controlled woman.
Proper.
And so I found, like in this journal I have here, which happens to be right after the time of Jim Elliott's death. And so here, pouring out page by page in her beautiful handwriting, her incredible prose.
And let me just interrupt a sec, Ellen, to say for those who aren't familiar with the story, just give us a nutshell of who Jim Elliott was and what she had just experienced when she made this entry.
In her early years at Wheaton College, Elizabeth Howard, her maiden name, had fallen madly in love with Jim Elliott. And after a long courtship, they had married and they were missionaries in Ecuador together. And they had a vision of reaching an unreached people group, an indigenous people who had never heard of the gospel and were known for their violence. And Jim and 4 of his colleagues felt that God was leading them bit by bit through a lot of careful planning to make contact with this unreached people group. In spite of many positive indications that it would be peaceful, in fact, all 5 of the men were speared to death. And as Elisabeth and her fellow widows mourned, they all felt committed to continue on in ministry of various types, and Elisabeth felt that if there was any way she could, she wanted to go to the tribal people who had killed her husband. That's another story we can talk about maybe on another day. But she did so and lived among the people who had taken her husband's life and really lived out the gospel among them incarnationally. I was struck, as I said, as I had all of these wonderful journals to see, again, unfolding in real time, what she was thinking. And many of us thought, if you've read Through Gates of Splendor, that's a very detailed and yet a dispassionate account of the missionaries' deaths.
And you think she must have just been very strong.
And she was very strong. But what you find in these journals, and what I've included liberally in the book, because I think we all can relate so well to this kind of loss, is what she was feeling day by day, and particularly night by night after Jim was killed.
Yeah.
And she dreamed of him constantly. And here's just a sample where she is writing in the journal about having dreamed about Jim again. And she's dreamed that she's with him and he's wearing his favorite tweed coat, and she buries her face in the smell of Jim and wearing his coat. And she is saying, this isn't a dream, is it, darling? This is not a dream again. And he's like, no, this time I am back for real. So what I wanted to read you is a particularly poignant journal entry after Jim's death when she was dreaming of him constantly. And she said, 5:45 a.m., March 16th, I've just had one of the most vivid dreams ever. The theme, the same old song, Jim came back. He and Pete and Olive. Pete Fleming was one of the other missionaries who was murdered, and his wonderful wife, Olive. We were all in Morristown going shopping. Jim was wearing his favorite coat. Elisabeth buries her face in his shoulder, holding on to him tightly. And she kept saying to them, I'm so afraid that this is just another dream. And they're, no, this is real. We're back. And then there's an odd discussion of how their bodies were found in the river. And it's like, no, we really are here. I could not keep my eyes off of Jim. He was as handsome and cheerful as ever. I felt so happy that I had not decided to remarry because he was back. In her dream, she says, we went into a restaurant. I was telling Jim about my dream and how I had called my mother and told her that Jim was back. And he said, it's real, darling. This is really happening. And Then I said to Jim in the dream, "Oh, darling, if this turns out to be just another one of those dreams, I'll just die." On that last phrase, my voice choked to a sob, and he put his arm around me, and he squeezed me hard to reassure me that this was no dream. With that, I woke, in the same hammock, the same gray mist, the same embered fire beside me, and the jovial voices nearby within the tribe of Dewey and Kimu, two of Jim's killers.
Wow.
When you read material like that and you think, wow, how is it that God orchestrates all the days of our lives? And I want to know more about this woman who went through such incredible loss and wrote about it in ways that all of us who have experienced loss can identify. And yet how she stayed steady, how she stayed true in her relationship with Jesus. That's a transferable truth that comes out of this story that I was excited to discover and try to write in a way that it would be accessible to readers, to be of help in their lives.
And for any of us, who we are as adults is shaped and influenced by our childhood, our family of origin. And there were some remarkable aspects of Elisabeth's upbringing that were unique to her and that influenced and shaped her as she was becoming the Elisabeth Elliot we knew and loved. What did you find about her childhood or her younger years? Because you spent some time there that was really interesting to me. How did that shape her for better or for worse? Because we get things from our childhood that send us in the right direction, and then we get things we have to overcome. And she had some of both.
Sure. I mean, we all have a mix of influences in our lives. And Elisabeth's parents were missionaries in Belgium when she was born. So they then came back to the United States, and her dad became editor of the Sunday School Times, which at the time was a big periodical that went out to all of Christendom.
Yeah, premier.
Yeah. And so she grew up in a large family where all the kids were expected to be punctual and prompt, and there was morning devotions, there were evening devotions. One sang all the hymns with all 5 of the verses. One kept everything in exact order. All the pencils were sharpened, the shoes were shined, the windows were cleaned, the floors were waxed. It was a home, in spite of the number of people there, that was of extreme order and discipline.
I'm thinking of The Sound of Music before Julie Andrews came.
Yes, well, it was
a lot of order.
It was a lot of order. Now, Elisabeth's family was so kind to me. I interviewed her brothers and her close friends and quite a few. And what Tom Howard, her younger brother, said is, if you describe it as this place of incredible order, it sounds like it was no fun, but it was a house of great fun. Yes. There was much laughing till they all cried, and there was a lot of wit. There was a lot of mimicry in terms of being able to reproduce accents and tell stories with great vigor, and so a close, rollicking family. Elisabeth went from this home of great order to an unnamed boarding school, a Christian boarding school, which at the time was the place that a lot of prominent Christian families sent their kids for high school. And there, the same tendencies toward order were reinforced. If you had dust under your bed, then you shouldn't carry your Bible around. Sloth was an indication of running morally rampant. And so it seems to me as an outsider, reading the journals and the interviews with people from those school days and reading Elisabeth's many, many letters, that this was a place that had the tendency, shall we say, to enhance legalism. All right? And so that already kind of coupled with the young Elisabeth Elliot's personality, that we check off the boxes, we do all the right things. If we love God, then everything is tidy and in order and just right. And she already was an introvert by nature. She already spent a lot of time, quote, in her own head. And she already had a very severe way of looking at her own self and behaviors. And so she went from then, that high school, to Wheaton College near the end of World War II. So a highly patriotic time in the country, a time when a number of young men who had served in the Army were coming back to Wheaton for school. And there, too, there was a great sense of duty and performance and discipline. A lot of other wonderful things as well. When you read the book, you'll see how her college years were a great time of flowering in a lot of different ways. But I need to pause there because it's interesting. She wrote in her journal during her college years, "Today we took a test in psychology class, and I have discovered that I'm an introvert. I have 11 of the 12 tendencies of an introvert." And she felt like it is a very bad thing to be an introvert. Clearly, I must change. And all of her life, people who saw her as remote, I think the introversion explains a lot. Mm-hmm. She would get completely all of her energy used up in social situations. Or if you saw her in a setting where she was speaking and then you waited in a long book line maybe to come and talk to Elisabeth Elliot, and if she might be brusque, she might even be rude. It's because as an introvert, all of her energy had been used up just in being around people. So there were insights like that I picked up along the way that explained a lot to me about her personality.
And also the fact that a lot of her childhood influence was that you don't express emotions.
Yes.
You control your emotions.
Yes.
And she went through many emotional seasons of her life, but it's more in her journals, it seems, that she unpacked what some of her emotions was, things that maybe she didn't feel free to share publicly or with even some of her close friends, but the feelings were there.
Yes.
We're going to talk later in this series about what she did with those feelings that was positive and how she taught us to deal with runaway, rogue emotions. But it felt like there was a cap on that. And then she got to Wheaton College and meets Jim Elliott. And first of all, she had been, I remember, was this a season where she had made a list of the things that she wanted in a husband, this long list?
Yes. I mean, she, in her later years, I think forgot that she had dated so much at Wheaton. Sometimes in the journals, you'll see the older Elisabeth's handwriting coming in and saying things like, I hadn't remembered I went out this much, or that type of thing. So it was fun to discover a college romance that I had not been aware of. That was before Jim, for example. And Jim Elliott was a guy in her Greek class. He was a close friend of her brother, her younger brother, Dave, who's 13 months younger than Elisabeth. And initially she thought that Jim was a good guy. He had a reputation on campus for being a little too uber spiritual. And so she noted him, but was not necessarily attracted to him. Then Dave invited Jim to come home for Christmas one year. To the Howard family home, Elisabeth's family home. And there, Elisabeth really watched Jim and saw how he washed dishes for the old lady who had brought them wonderful food to eat, or how he would just enter into whatever, or how he went sledding with the younger kids. And the two of them would stay up late at night and talk about philosophy and theology and the things about which they were both very curious. And what I love to see in the sort of the inner cycling of the romance, especially in those early days, is she felt like she had found her soulmate, someone who wondered about the same things she wondered about, who almost would finish a sentence for her before she had expressed her thought. That was a new feeling for her. She had been perhaps a little bit intellectually and emotionally lonely prior to that. So you have rollicking Jim Elliott, the school wrestler, and by now a pretty popular guy on campus, and the somewhat aloof Elisabeth Howard. And against all odds, these two fall in love. Now, that romance is pretty well chronicled in books that your listeners may well be familiar with.
The first time Elisabeth went to visit Jim's family didn't go quite as well as when Jim went to visit her family. Tell us about that.
Yes. So they realized that they had strong feelings for one another. And they were 20, 21 years old. It boggles my mind at this time. They both felt, once they recognized that, yes, they really could love each other, that love was to be sacrificed, if God so asked, on the cross for him. They both felt that they needed to cleave first to the love of Christ, and secondarily, if he so willed, to do something about their relationship. It's hard to find 21-year-olds who think that way, and I certainly didn't think that way when I was 21. At any rate, their relationship continued. They wrote millions of letters to each other, very beautiful and literary letters. And
this was not the email generation or the texting generation.
And no emojis. I mean,
exactly.
So thoughts were actually articulated. It was wonderful. But Elisabeth was invited to spend, I think, a Labor Day weekend with the Elliott family in Oregon. And she went, and they had a wonderful time swimming in the ocean and picnicking and singing and worshiping with the family. It seemed to have gone quite well. When Elisabeth got home, she has a letter from Jim that basically says, "You made a universally horrible impression. Your visit was a disaster." Now, at that point, I would have completely given up on Jim Elliott and gone in the opposite direction. But Elisabeth read the rest of the letter and discovered that his family had seen her as very standoffish. And so some of those things about her personality that were a little bit off-putting, the Elliott family, which was very different from the Howard family, had seen as a distance that they did not care for.
And they said some harsh things.
Some very harsh things.
That Jim later regretted having passed on to Elisabeth.
Yes, but she was a gifted debater in her years at Wheaton College. And so in her responses to Jim, even though he had mortally wounded her by relating his family's less than positive remarks about not just her personality, but also what she looked like.
Yeah, right.
At any rate, once she had gotten over the shock of those things, she rallied and almost as if she was on the debating team, began to make points about what she felt was viable and that she had chosen within the relationship and what was not. And that kind of robust intellectual and spiritual back and forth really characterized their 5-year courtship.
And some of that back and forth over those 5 years was because both of them had this passion for Christ, this passion for ministry, this sense of calling to missions. And it seems that both of them on their own were wondering, am I called to singleness?
Right.
Is it less spiritual for me to get married? And they had a lot of back and forth in their own hearts and then in their relationship about whether it was okay to get married and whether you could really love God with all your heart and still choose marriage.
Right. And I have to say, perhaps I am not the best judge of all of this, but as the biographer, I'm standing on the sidelines looking at this as it unfolds and thinking, oh my goodness, just get married and go to the field together. What's all the big deal? But for them, they were really weighing and very careful to make sure that their commitment to obedience to Christ was above all else. And I think that flies in the face of what so many of the rest of us have experienced and certainly what goes on in our culture at large.
You're in love, follow your heart, get married.
Right.
And
right.
They wanted Christ first.
Right.
You read some of how they went about it, and at times you do think, right, just you both love Jesus and you can love each other too.
Right.
But one of the hallmarks of Elisabeth's life as we knew her later was this deep commitment to obedience, to not just follow your feelings. She learned that it was okay to have feelings, but that all feelings and personal desires had to be brought into submission to the obedience of Christ.
Right. And that was interesting to me because in the midst of her relationship with Jim Elliott, she constantly had her feelings bridled. And she wrote a very poignant letter to her mom at that time and talked about from the time she was young, she had, quote, taken pride in bottling her feelings. She had taken pride that people not know what she was feeling. She had somehow gotten mixed up early on that stoicism was a virtue.
And that feelings were
To be ignored
right.
or to be disguised or not
Suppressed.
to be acknowledged, all of that. And then she came to realize, of course, that that was not the case. But she was so constraining herself not to blurt out to Jim how much she loved him, not to get ahead of him in his leadership of the relationship, that at times it drove her crazy.
And at times it drives me crazy reading about it.
Yes, of course. I'm just amazed that they both hung in there.
You're thinking, get with the program, Jim.
Right. So when they both were pursuing the relationship, but not pursuing the relationship. And as God was guiding them, they both knew they were called to the mission field. Elisabeth initially thought to a hut in Africa. That was a picture she had in her head from childhood.
And she had grown up having missionaries visit in their home.
Yes.
So this had made a real mark on her.
Yes, very much so. Been very affected by missionaries, in fact, who had been martyred, who had lost their lives in the midst of bringing the gospel to people who had not heard it. Very strong part of who she was way prior to meeting Jim Elliott. So in her pursuit of God's will for her, she spent some time in New York City. I wasn't familiar with this part of her story. She lived in a tenement flat in Brooklyn and worked with an Hispanic congregation there, learning her Spanish and working with the Plymouth, under the auspices of the Plymouth Brethren. And during that time, she met a woman missionary who talked with great passion about an unreached people group in Ecuador known as the Waodani, and that they were violent, they killed all outsiders, and they had never heard the gospel. And so, though many of us think that Elisabeth Elliot's interest in the Waodani came because of Jim Elliott, in fact, it came through another female missionary who dared to dream that where men had failed, perhaps women could go and bring the gospel to this violent tribe.
And so she and Jim both ended up in Ecuador, but at different mission stations.
Correct.
Not married yet, but staying in contact. And in God's providence, he did bring their lives together. We're going to pick up on that part of the story when we continue this conversation. But Ellen, I want to just say that I think one of the really helpful things you've done for those of us who knew and loved Elisabeth Elliot and those who are just being introduced to her life now, it's not too late, but you've helped us to see how her upbringing, how the influences in her life, in her childhood, in her teenage years, were all part of shaping and molding the woman that God was making to be used for his kingdom purposes. And some of those influences were extremely positive, and some of them were, well, things you wouldn't want to grow up with or have as a part of your experience. But in God's providence, he used all of that as she was becoming the woman we knew as Elisabeth Elliot. This is why I love reading Christian biographies, because they help me to lay on my own life and experience the stories and experiences of others who've had a journey of coming to know God, to walk with him, to serve him. And I could not be more thrilled that you have written this new authorized biography on the early years of Elisabeth Elliot.